Hi. The question I have is, are the typical pastors and preachers of today shying away from Paul's words and example when it comes to preaching for free? Often in their sermons that they preach to their congregations and the messages they give at conferences and so forth, traditional pastors and ministers will often cite and apply principles from the life of the Apostle Paul. For example, preachers will often exhort Christians to seek to imitate Paul when it comes to his joy, his contentment, his courage, his prayerfulness, his endurance, his love for Christ, his love for the unsaved, and so forth. And certainly all these things that characterize Paul's life are very important, and they have application for Christians today. Yet when is the last time you heard a preacher cite and apply all those passages which deal with Paul's practice of preaching for free? For example, consider 2 Corinthians 11:7, where Paul says, "Have I committed an offense in abasing myself that you might be exalted? Because I have preached to you the gospel of God freely." Or what about 1 Corinthians 9:14 through 18, where Paul speaks of how he gave up his right to receive support for his ministry in order that the gospel might not be hindered? As he says, "What is my reward then? Verily that when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel." Or what about Acts 20, verses 33-35, for Paul once again emphasizes how he didn't take any money for his ministry, but instead supported himself. As he says, "I've coveted no man's silver or gold or apparel. Yet you yourselves know that these hands have ministered unto my necessities, and to them that were with me. I've showed you all things, how that so laboring you ought to support the weak." Two more passages I want to cite. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 8, Paul says, Nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with toil and labor we work night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you." Again, he's emphasizing how he ministered for free. One last passage is 1 Thessalonians 2:9, where Paul says, "For you remember, brethren, our labor and travail, laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you. We preached unto you the gospel of God." Now, I've been a Christian for about 15 to 16 years, and I've probably heard thousands of sermons online and in person, and I strangely have never heard a traditional preacher, a preacher of your typical traditional church. I've never heard them give a sermon, give a message, exhorting Christians and especially elders to imitate Paul's example in ministering for free. I mean, have you? Please tell me if you have heard such a sermon. Pastors and preachers will generally tell everyone to imitate Paul in being content and being strong in the Lord and being fervent in prayer and being joyful and living for Christ and denying self and so forth. But when is the last time they've ever given a serious exhortation to Christian laborers, including pastors, to seriously consider laboring for free? Now, some might argue that Paul's words don't have much application for us today, as the context was supposedly different back then. But what was the context? Paul lived during a time when there was false teachers and philosophers who would travel about to make money off of people through charging people for their teaching. Now, such men didn't labor out of love, but they labored to make money. And thus, when Paul was traveling about and in preaching the gospel of Christ, he wanted to clearly distinguish himself from such men. And one of the ways he did that is by laboring for free. Now, this would ensure that those he preached to, as well as the enemies of Christ and his own enemies, they would have no grounds to accuse him of laboring only for the sake of money. Now, this was done ultimately for the spread of the gospel and for the reputation of Christ. So that was the context back then. Now, is this not the context that pastors and preachers find themselves in today? Of course it is. For one of the greatest accusations unbelievers make against churches, especially pastors, is that they're all about the money. Now, of course, they are wrong that some churches, it is not all about the money, but that's not the point. The point is that as long as pastors and preachers are salaried and they preach for pay, there's the opportunity for unbelievers to accuse them and suspect that they're laboring just to make money. And so it seems that Paul's example in regard to how he preached for free certainly has application for ministers today. Now let's put aside for a moment the question of whether or not pastors or preachers are entitled to receive a salary. Let's put that aside. Again, here's this question. In regard to Paul's example of ministering for free, when is the last time you heard a preacher exhort the congregation, and especially other preachers and other pastors, to consider seriously laboring in their ministries for free for the sake of the reputation of Christ and the gospel? Thank you, and God bless.